My name is McKitrick, and in this talk, I am going to be discussing the dispositional account of gender identity. So, to give a brief overview of my project here, my overall aim is to give a defense and something of a rehabilitation of a dispositional account of gender identity. To explain in a little bit more detail what I mean by a dispositional account of gender identity, I want to just clarify both of those terms. So, dispositions, here I'm following the philosophical literature and understanding dispositions as properties of entities that exist even when those properties do not manifest. So, standardly discussed examples of dispositions include things like fragility and solubility. So glasses are fragile even when they're not in the process of breaking, or even if they never actually break. Sugar is water soluble, even if it's never actually placed into water and thus never actually dissolves. These are modal properties in that sense that continue to exist even when they are not exercised, when they do not manifest. As far as gender identity goes, I'm understanding this as a property of individuals as opposed to gender in the broader sense referring to the social structures encompassing this notion as well. Obviously, insofar as gender is a property of individuals, it is also closely related to the social structure that constitutes gender as a whole. But I am just focusing here on gender as a property of individuals. I'm not going to give any kind of an account or defend a dispositional account of the social structure more broadly that gender is. And my aim here is to start from Jennifer McKitrick's 2015 dispositional account of gender and offer some structural solutions to what I take to be some big problems in her view. And I'm not going to try to offer the necessary and sufficient conditions for having any gender identity, nor the necessary and sufficient conditions for having, say, a specific gender identity, like being a man, being a woman, or being non-binary. I'm going to just argue that dispositionalists about gender should make something of a structural shift in how we think about the relevant dispositions. And in particular, I'm going to recommend that instead of just thinking about behavioral dispositions, we should shift to thinking about things like psychological dispositions, and thinking of those as the primary dispositions that are associated with having gender identity, as opposed to McKitrick's view, which focuses on behavioral dispositions instead. In terms of why I think this project is worth pursuing, two big reasons that I want to highlight here are first, that I think that a dispositional account of gender identity can do a lot in terms of an ameliorative account of gender identity. And especially if we're interested in developing a trans and non-binary inclusive account of gender identity. So one of the big reasons for this is because whenever we construe the dispositions associated with gender to be, if we take a dispositional understanding of gender identity, it's possible, given the social structures that exist, given the unjust nature of our societies, that people with trans and non-binary gender identities might not actually ever manifest those particular dispositions. So just as a simple example, say that we determined that the most relevant disposition is publicly identifying oneself as a member of a particular gender. Well, people who are worried about the social repercussions of doing so might never publicly identify as their gender if they're trans or non-binary especially. So a trans woman, for instance, might never publicly identify herself as a woman because she's worried about the social repercussions of doing so. But on a dispositional account, even if those dispositions never actually manifest, they still exist. And so a dispositional account gives us the grounds to say that a trans woman who never actually publicly identifies herself as a woman can still be a woman in the relevant sense, because she still has this dispositional property, even if it never actually manifests. On top of this, I think that there's also some just inherent theoretical interest in determining what kind of a property gender identity is. Dispositional properties are usually contrasted with categorical properties in the literature on this topic. So categorical properties, as standardly construed, include things like triangularity and two-armedness, so things that are sort of always present of particular entities. Triangles are always displaying the characteristic of being triangular. Beings with two arms are always displaying that. It's not a sort of property that exists beneath the surface in any sort of way. And so there is this just theoretically interesting question of whether gender identity as a property is dispositional, is categorical, or is perhaps some other kind of property that maybe is both dispositional and categorical. Or maybe it's some collection of properties that is some of which are dispositional, some of which are categorical. So I think that pursuing the dispositional theory or the dispositional kind of gender identity to its furthest extent can help us a little bit in answering this interesting theoretical question of what kind of property gender identity is. So I want to move now to Jennifer McKitrick's 2015 view. McKitrick proposes this as an account of gender identity. She argues that some person X is gender G if and only if X has sufficiently many or sufficiently strong dispositions D1 through Dn to behave in ways B1 through Bn in situations S1 through Sn, and the relevant social group considers behaving in those ways B1 through Bn in those situations S1 through Sn to be G. McKitrick emphasizes that these are extrinsic dispositions, so gender identity is not a supervenient property. Gender identity can vary based on one's social circumstances. So a person who has some set of behavioral dispositions might be identified as being one gender in one particular society and another gender in some other society. As far as what the relevant behaviors might be, McKitrick argues that these could include things like modes of dress, posture and mannerisms, productive and leisure time activities, styles of communication, and social interaction. McKitrick further emphasizes that these can correspond or often do correspond to psychological characteristics, but she does not spell out the precise relationship between these, what kind of a correspondence relationship there is, whether there necessarily always is a correspondence relationship. Those sorts of questions are left unanswered in her account, but she does acknowledge that there is some psychological component to this as well. So I want to turn now to a couple of problems for McKitrick's view. And the first problem, the problem that I think is the most fundamental to McKitrick's view is that behavioral dispositions can be associated with more than one gender. So a lot of the assumptions underlying McKitrick's view rely on the assumption that there is a clean delineation between certain kinds of behaviors with respect to different genders. So there's an assumption that any given society is going to associate some set of behaviors with one gender and some other set of behaviors with some other gender. There might be borderline cases. Of course, there might be cases where it's not entirely clear whether a certain behavior is associated with, for instance, men or with women. But there is still this assumption that behaviors are going to be associated with one or the other. But if we look at the actual range of behaviors that we tend to think of as gendered in some sense, there are many behaviors, especially those surrounding things like beauty norms, that are associated with more than one gender. So in the West, for instance, certain beauty norms like shaving one's face can be associated with both men and with women. So in professional environments, men are expected to be clean shaven. In more general cases, men who can't grow full beards are expected to be clean shaven as well. It's just a beauty norm that generally holds. And women, of course, are expected not to have hair on their faces. That is a beauty norm in the West that exists. And the problem here for a view like McKitrick's is that an account that focuses just on behavioral dispositions, just on something like the behavior of shaving one's face or something like that, and not the underlying psychological reasons for why people act, for why people engage in those behavioral dispositions, we can't explain why behaviors like that are actually gendered. So it's not as though shaving one's face is associated with being a man or associated with being a woman. And in order to understand why it is that we associate this behavior with both being a man and with being a woman in the West, we need to go beyond just that behavioral disposition itself and really explore the psychological side for it, explore the reasons for which people act. And without doing that, just focusing on the behavioral dispositions alone, we can't get a full understanding of why this is a gendered behavior, why this is something that we associate with certain genders. On top of this particular objection that I'm missing here, other people have leveled other objections against McKitrick's view. So Katharine Jenkins, for instance, argues that a dispositional view can't ground the kind of respect that gender identities warrant. So when we're explaining why it is that we should treat people in accordance with their gender identities, why it is that we should think of gender identity as something important, generally speaking, Jenkins argues that just focusing on people's behavioral dispositions alone can't give us a good reason to do so. She gives an example comparing this to aristocracies, saying that it would be like saying that an aristocrat deserves to be treated in an aristocratic fashion, treated with deference and respect and so on, called by their title and given certain advantages and so on, solely because they have some aristocratic behavioral dispositions, which is clearly an absurd proposition. And so Jenkins argues that then this the dispositional view just by itself, focusing on behavioral dispositions, can't give us a good explanation for why we should treat gender identities with the respect that they deserve. Dembroff also argues that this dispositional view can't account for genderqueer identities, and argues that this is largely because people who are genderqueer might never actually engage in any of the behaviors that we think of as associated with genderqueer in virtue of the fact that they might be worried about social pressures. And moreover, Dembroff raises something of a similar objection to what I've just discussed here, in pointing out that there is actually no behavior or set of behaviors that we associate exclusively with being genderqueer. And so to get around this kind of a problem, I am going to propose a structural solution for the dispositional view. So this will get around primarily the problem that I'm raising here about the association with between particular behaviors and particular genders, but it will, I think, also address these objections that Jenkins and Dembroff have raised. And so the solution that I'm proposing is that a dispositional account of gender identity should distinguish between two ways in which the dispositions in question can actually manifest. Rather than analyze gender identity solely in terms of behaviors, we should instead analyze it in terms of dispositions to have certain psychological states and to act in virtue of having those psychological states. And I think that we should really focus more so on the first half of this equation. But when we're thinking about what it is in terms of dispositions that constitutes gender identity, we should be thinking about dispositions in the more psychological sense. Dispositions to develop certain psychological states, dispositions to think in certain ways, dispositions to feel in certain ways, dispositions to weigh certain reasons, those sorts of things. And then think of the actual behavioral dispositions in which people engage as secondary to that. And so, like I mentioned earlier, Jennifer McKitrick does acknowledge a relationship between psychological characteristics and the behavioral dispositions that are associated with gender. She doesn't really explore this relationship fully. And so I think that what I'm going to do here will take us down that path of exploring this relationship a little bit more closely. And so what I want to do now is give a brief analogy to philosophical discussions of skill. And so Jason Stanley and Timothy Williamson, their 2017 account of skill, analyze skills as dispositions to know. So ordinarily speaking, we think of something like a skill at tennis and manifesting in a person playing tennis well, playing tennis successfully. But they think that the primary way in which somebody's skill at tennis manifests is in knowledge states. So they call these manifestations 1 as opposed to manifestations 2, which are the actual behaviors that a skilled person engages in. But they say that the primary manifestation of a skill is in knowledge states, is in certain psychological states that a person develops in virtue of having this skill. So in the case of tennis, if you're a skilled tennis player, your skill manifests 1 in knowing how to return your opponent's serve and knowing where to move next when your opponent is getting ready to hit the ball back to you, when to swing your racket, how to arrange your feet on the ground in order to cover the most ground possible, all those sorts of things. And then when you actually engage in those, if you're a skilled tennis player, those are manifestations 2 of your skill. It's these secondary manifestations. And they think that these are very much an important part of what skills are, but these are not the primary manifestations of someone's skills. And so I think that a structure like this can be brought over to discussions of gender and gender identity with respect to the dispositional account. And so when we are talking about these gender dispositions, things like engaging in certain patterns of behavior and so on, as opposed to just thinking about the action of whatever behavior it is that we're talking about. So for instance, with the one that I wrote earlier, shading one's face, or with any other kind of behavioral disposition, like identifying oneself as a member of a gender, requesting that other people refer to you with certain pronouns, wearing certain clothing, going to certain places in a store, using certain bathrooms, all those sorts of things, the behaviors that we ordinarily associate with genders, we should think of those as manifestations too, in standard Williamson sense. So we should not think of those as the primary manifestations of gender identities under a dispositional framework. Instead, we should think of various mental states as the manifestations one in Stanley Williamson sense as the primary manifestations here. And so by looking at both of these kinds of manifestations, we can confirm that the same behaviors might be related to or associated with more than one gender identity. So take, for instance, the case that I discussed earlier of people shaving. So it's clear that shaving is in some sense associated with gender, just because shaving is shaving one's face, that is clearly something that is dictated by beauty norms that apply to people of different genders differently. And so if we look at the manifestations one in this case, this would be things like people's judgments that certain beauty norms apply to them, people reasoning to certain conclusions about what they ought to do in virtue of those beauty norms applying to them. And then the manifestations too are going to be the same across different genders. So the manifestation two of shaving one's face, for instance, might be exactly the same for the dispositions that are associated with being a man as they are for the dispositions associated with being a woman, as they are for the dispositions associated with being genderqueer. But in all these different cases, the manifestations one will be different because people will form different judgments about why they ought to shave their own faces. So focusing here on the psychological side of things can get us around this primary problem that I've raised for McKitrick's account. As far as some other implications of this discussion go, one important thing to note is that a dispositional account of gender identity like this that focuses more so on psychological or mental dispositions can easily incorporate other elements of other accounts of gender identity. So looking at Jenkins's norm relevancy account, for instance, according to which to say that someone has a female gender identity is to say that she experiences the norms that are associated with women in her social context is relevant to her. This is just a brief statement of Jenkins's view. It's quite a bit more complicated than this, but just as a brief statement. This is the sort of thing that can very easily be incorporated into a dispositional account. And this is because somebody still has a gender identity even when they're not actively taking norms to be relevant to them. The dispositional framework allows us a way to attribute those properties to them at times when they're not actively thinking about which norms are relevant to them and which norms are not. And this is because dispositions, as I mentioned earlier, still exist even when they are not actively manifesting, even if they do not ever actually manifest. So a person who's not actively thinking about what norms apply to them, who's not actively thinking about anything like that, is still the gender that they are because they still have that dispositional property or that dispositional profile or set of properties. On top of that, I think that a view that focuses on psychological dispositions can also dispel some other worries about McKitrick's account, such as Jenkins's worry that behavioral dispositions alone can't ground the respect that gender identities warrant. Psychological dispositions can clearly do so, much in the same way that I mentioned that this account, by focusing on psychological dispositions, can take in something similar to Jenkins's view. It can also bring in the elements of Jenkins's view that allow Jenkins's own view to get around this problem with grounding respect for gender identities. So thank you. I look forward to hearing everyone's questions about this.